Mila Johansen here with another story about my famous suffragette grandmother from our new book, From Cowgirl to Congress. Jessie Haver Butler was my grandmother who partially raised me, who was a suffragette on the front lines when women finally won the vote in 1920 on August 18th. It's in honor of the 100th anniversary coming up this August 18th. And she was raised on a Colorado cattle ranch and had a very tough childhood. Her mother died when she was 10, and a series of other tragedies occurred. But a teacher saw how bright she was and finally got her into Smith College. And she never looked back. She went to the East Coast and was propelled into the suffrage movement. Her first job after Smith College was helping Professor Cunliffe put together the Pulitzer School of Journalism at Columbia, if you can imagine, in 1911. And her second job, she helped set the first minimum wage from women from $4 a week to $8 a week. It doubled in Boston. And then she was brought down to Washington, D.C. to become the lobbyist to create the minimum wage for the entire country from $4 a week to $8 a week. And then she met Alice Paul and Carrie Chapman Catt and worked tirelessly for many years with them to create the vote for women. She was friends with Alice Paul and had lunch with her every day in her home across from the White House, but she didn't want to join the militants because she was a parliamentarian and she believed in that method rather than the militant method. But she always said if we didn't have both Alice Paul and Carrie Chapman Catt with their two different ideas, we may not have gotten the vote as soon as we did. And I would have thought that Alice Paul was more like the hippie of the age, but she was a Quaker from a very wealthy family. And she attended the London School of Economics and got her PhD. That is where she met Emmeline Pankhurst and learned the militant form of marching for suffrage and brought it back to the US and created a huge group of women that she worked with. Alice and Jessie were the same age, and Carrie Chapman Catt was a lot older. She had been mentored by Susan B. Anthony and handed the baton by Susan B. Anthony to carry on the work. So these are very, very powerful women, and Jessie worked right alongside of them. The great story, the last day on August 18th, when women finally won the vote, is that 37 states had ratified, and we needed 38. Tennessee was the next one to vote, and most of them were going to vote against it. And so everyone headed down to Nashville, and all the meat packers, the liquor coalition, all the lobbyists for the steel industry who didn't want women to get the vote. And Carrie Chapman Catt and her women headed down there, and they were taunted and spit upon. They weren't happy they were there, but they stood their ground. And the last vote was up to a young man named Harry Byrne. And at the last minute, he voted for ratification. And all the men came up to him and thumped him on the back and said, "Why did you vote for it? You were supposed to vote against it." And he said, "Well, I received a letter from my mother, and she told me to vote for it." So the power of mothers, right? And here's what the letter said. "Dear son, hurrah, and vote for suffrage. Don't keep them in doubt. I noticed some of the speeches against. They were bitter. I have been watching to see how you stood, but have noticed nothing yet. Don't forget to be a good boy and help Mrs. Catt put the rat in ratification. Your mother." The newspapermen were so excited that they all rented cars. They didn't have a lot of cars back then. So they rented cars and they drove up into the hills to find this woman on her farm. And she was coming out of the cow barn with 2 pails of milk. And they accosted her. And she invited them in to sit at her kitchen table and gave them each a glass of milk and something she had baked that morning. And when they asked her, why did she write that letter to her son, she said, "Well, the winters are long here in the Tennessee mountains, and we're always reading Shakespeare. And Shakespeare is always funning with words, so I thought maybe I could fun with some words. And that is how 17 million women won the right to vote on August 18th, 1920.